The ledger book hit the desk with such force that dust exploded into the lamplight, and Victoria Lancaster looked up from the chaos of scattered papers to see a woman standing in his doorway, her belly round beneath a threadbare traveling dress, her face pale as winter moonlight. She swayed on her feet, one hand braced against the doorframe, and he was halfway across the room before he realized he had moved at all. "I heard you needed a bookkeeper," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her legs. "I can keep numbers better than any man in this territory, and I will work for room and board until I prove my worth." Victoria caught her elbow just as her knees buckled, and up close he could see the dark circles beneath her eyes, the fine tremor in her hands that spoke of exhaustion and hunger. She could not have been more than 22 years old, and she was at least 6 months along, maybe more. His ranch foreman had quit 3 weeks ago after Victoria refused to sell the cattle at a loss, and in the chaos since then, the financial records had become a disaster that threatened everything his father had built over 30 years. He needed help desperately, but this was not what he had imagined. "When did you last eat?" he asked instead of answering her question, her chin lifted with pride even as her body sagged against his supporting arm. "That is not relevant to my qualifications, Mr. Lancaster. I studied mathematics at a ladies' academy in Philadelphia before circumstances changed. I can organize your accounts, project your expenses, and find efficiencies you did not know existed. All I ask is a roof and food until spring." Victoria guided her to the chair beside his desk and moved quickly to the small stove in the corner where a pot of beef stew had been simmering since morning. He ladled a generous portion into a bowl and brought it to her with a chunk of bread. "Eat first. We will discuss business after." She looked at the food with such naked hunger that it made his chest tight, but her hands stayed folded in her lap. "I do not accept charity. If you are not interested in hiring me, I will find work elsewhere." "I am interested," he said, surprised to realize it was true. "But I do not conduct business with people who are about to faint from hunger. Eat, and then show me what you can do with those numbers." Her name was Eleanor Price, and she had come west on a wagon train that had dissolved in Denver when half the families decided to turn back before winter set in. She told him this in spare, careful sentences as she ate, not mentioning the father of her child or why she was alone. Victoria did not press her. In Colorado Territory in 1876, people came west to escape something or to find something, and a woman in her condition traveling alone had clearly run out of other options. While she ate, he pulled out the disaster of ledgers and receipts that had accumulated since his foreman left. The ranch ran 500 head of cattle across 3,000 acres in the mountains west of Fairplay, and between the hands, the feed, the equipment repairs, and the loan his father had taken before his death 6 months ago, Victoria was drowning in numbers he could barely decipher. He knew ranching, knew cattle and horses and the land, but the financial side had always been his father's domain, and then the foreman's after the old man passed. Eleanor set down the empty bowl and reached for the top ledger without being asked. Her fingers moved across the pages with swift certainty, her eyes scanning columns of numbers that made Victoria's head ache. She was silent for several minutes, turning pages, occasionally pausing to study an entry more closely. Then she reached for a blank sheet of paper and began writing in a clear, precise hand. "Your accounts are in disorder, but the situation is not hopeless," she said, still writing. "You have been paying too much for feed because you are ordering through a middleman in Denver, instead of contracting directly with the supplier in Golden. Your horse breeding program is costing more than it generates, and you would be better served selling all but your essential stock and focusing resources on the cattle. You are carrying 4 ranch hands when 3 would suffice if you reorganize the rotation schedule. And the loan payment schedule your father agreed to is structured inefficiently. If the bank will renegotiate to quarterly payments instead of monthly, you will have better cash flow during the lean months. Victoria stared at her as she continued to write, laying out a complete financial analysis from a 15-minute examination of records that had baffled him for weeks. "How can you possibly know all that so quickly?" She looked up, and for the first time he saw a flicker of warmth in her serious gray eyes. "Numbers tell stories if you know how to listen to them. Your ranch is bleeding money in small cuts rather than one fatal wound. Fix the small problems, and the large problem solves itself." He pulled up a second chair and sat beside her. "Show me." They worked until past midnight, Eleanor walking him through each inefficiency she had identified, explaining how costs could be reduced or revenue increased. Her mind was extraordinary, able to hold dozens of figures simultaneously, and see patterns that would have taken him hours to uncover. By the time the lamp oil ran low, she had sketched out a complete reorganization plan that would, according to her calculations, save the ranch by spring if implemented correctly. "The room above the kitchen used to be for the cook," Victoria said as he showed her upstairs, carrying the small traveling bag that contained everything she owned. "It has a stove and a bed, and it stays warm. You can work in the office during the day, and I will pay you $20 a month once we start seeing the savings you have projected." Eleanor stopped in the doorway of the small room, looking at the clean bed and the firewood stacked beside the stove as if she were seeing a palace. "You are taking a considerable risk, hiring someone in my condition. You are taking a considerable risk, accepting work from a stranger," he countered. "We both need what the other has to offer. That seems like fair terms to me." She turned to face him, and in the dim hallway he could see the wariness in her expression, the hard-learned caution of someone who had been hurt and was determined not to be hurt again. "I will work harder than anyone you have ever employed, Mr. Lancaster. You will not regret this decision." "Victoria," he said, "if we are going to save this ranch together, you should call me Victoria." The wariness did not leave her eyes, but she nodded. "Victoria, and I am Eleanor." He left her to settle in and walked back down to the office, looking at the neat columns of figures she had written. The clear, logical plan that might actually save everything his family had built. Outside, December wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled at the cold stars. Victoria Lancaster was 30 years old, and he had been running this ranch alone since his father died, refusing offers from neighboring ranchers who wanted to buy him out, determined to prove he could manage without help. Pride had nearly cost him everything. He looked at the ceiling, thinking of the woman upstairs, pregnant and alone and carrying secrets she would not share. Whatever her story was, whatever had brought her to his door, she had just offered him hope when he had been about to lose hope entirely. The least he could do was make sure she and her baby were safe and fed through the winter. The next morning, Victoria woke to the smell of coffee and found Eleanor already in the office, dressed in the same threadbare dress, but with her hair neatly pinned and her face determined. She had reorganized the entire desk, creating stacks of documents sorted by category, and she had a list of tasks ready for him. "First, we need to inventory every asset on this ranch," she said briskly. "Every horse, every piece of equipment, every store of feed and supplies. I cannot create an accurate budget without knowing exactly what resources we have. Second, I need to see the contract with your current feed supplier and the terms of your father's loan. Third, You should ride to the Harrison Ranch today and discuss purchasing their yearling bull. According to your breeding records, your herd needs new bloodlines, and I heard in town yesterday that Harrison is selling because his son wants to move to California. Victoria accepted the coffee cup she handed him and tried to keep up with her rapid-fire instructions. You went to town yesterday. When you could barely stand, a faint color touched her cheeks. I recovered quickly after eating, and I needed to understand the local economic situation to properly advise you. Fairplay is still growing from the mining boom, which means there is a stable market for beef. However, the silver production is starting to decline, which means prices may drop in the next 2 years. You should position the ranch to either diversify income sources or to expand the customer base to Denver before that happens. He sat down slowly, looking at this woman who had appeared at his door less than 12 hours ago and who was now discussing economic forecasts and breeding strategies with absolute confidence. "Did you sleep at all?" "Some," she said dismissively. "Sleep can wait until the crisis is resolved. Your ranch cannot." They fell into a routine over the following days that felt oddly natural despite its strangeness. Eleanor worked in the office every morning, bringing order to the chaos of paperwork, while Victoria rode out to manage the ranch operations. In the afternoons, they worked together, Eleanor teaching him how to read the financial indicators that would tell him if the ranch was improving. Victoria explaining the practical realities of ranching that had to be factored into her calculations. She was brilliant and fierce and utterly unwilling to accept failure, and he found himself watching her more than the numbers sometimes, fascinated by the intensity of her focus. She never spoke about her past or the father of her child, and Victoria did not ask. The ranch hands accepted her presence with the pragmatic indifference of men who cared more about their pay arriving on time than about the personal lives of others. And the cook, who came in daily to prepare meals, clucked over Eleanor's thinness and made sure she ate properly. By Christmas, Eleanor's projections were already proving accurate. The new feed contract saved $40 a month, and selling the excess horses brought in enough cash to make the January loan payment with room to spare. Victoria renegotiated the loan terms, and the banker, impressed by the clear financial records Eleanor presented, agreed to the quarterly schedule she had proposed. On Christmas Eve, Victoria brought a small pine tree into the office and set it on the corner of the desk. Eleanor looked up from her work, startled. "It is Christmas," he said, feeling suddenly foolish. "I thought we should mark the occasion." Her expression softened in a way he had not seen before, vulnerability replacing the usual armor of competence. "I have not celebrated Christmas in 2 years." "Then we are overdue," he said firmly. He pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper and set it beside the tree. "This is not charity," he added quickly, seeing her stiffen. "You have earned every cent of your wages and more. This is simply a gift from one friend to another." She hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I made something for you as well. I know it is not much." Inside the paper was a beautifully drawn chart showing the ranch's financial recovery, with projections extending through the next 5 years. She had illustrated it with careful detail, tiny drawings of cattle and horses decorating the margins, and at the top she had written in elegant script, "The Lancaster Ranch, a legacy preserved." Victoria looked at it for a long moment, his throat tight. "This is the finest gift anyone has ever given me." "Open yours," she said softly, and he heard something new in her voice, something almost shy. Inside the package was a ledger book, but not just any ledger. He had spent a week in Denver finding one bound in leather with her initials stamped in gold on the cover. "For when you start your own bookkeeping business," he said. After the baby comes, and you have had time to rest, I thought you might want to offer your services to other ranchers. God knows they need the help, and you could name your own price. Eleanor touched the leather cover with trembling fingers, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were bright with tears she refused to let fall. You think I could do that? I think you could do anything you set your mind to, Victoria said honestly. You saved my ranch in less than a month, Eleanor. Imagine what you could accomplish if you had time and resources. She stood abruptly and walked to the window, her hand resting on her belly in the unconscious gesture he had seen her make 100 times. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, thick flakes drifting down to blanket the mountains in white. The father of my child was a merchant in Philadelphia, she said quietly. We were engaged to be married. Then his business failed, and he broke the engagement the day after I told him I was carrying his child. He said he could not afford a wife and baby, and that I should handle the situation discreetly. My family was mortified by the scandal. My father gave me train fare west and told me not to return until I had remade myself into someone respectable. Victoria moved to stand beside her, close enough that he could feel the heat of her body but not touching. He was a fool, she laughed, a broken sound that was half sob. He was a businessman making a practical decision. I was the fool for believing pretty words and promises. No, Victoria said firmly. Love should not be practical, and breaking promises is the act of a coward, not a businessman. She turned to face him, and in the lamplight her gray eyes were storm-dark and searching. You barely know me. Why would you defend me so fiercely? I know that you are brilliant and brave, and you fight for what you believe in, he said. I know that you walked into a stranger's ranch and saved it from ruin because you needed to prove your worth, even though you had already proven it 1,000 times over just by surviving. I know that any man who could not see the treasure he had in you is not worth your tears. The distance between them seemed to shrink without either of them moving, and Victoria could see the pulse beating in her throat, could see the way her breath caught. He wanted to touch her, wanted it with an intensity that shocked him, but he kept his hands carefully at his sides. I am pregnant with another man's child, Eleanor whispered. I have no family, no money, no prospects beyond what you have given me. Why are you looking at me like that? Like what? Like I am something precious. Victoria allowed himself the liberty of reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face, his fingers barely grazing her cheek. Because you are. She closed her eyes, and a single tear tracked down her face. You should not say such things to me. I am not free to hear them. You are more free than you have ever been, he said gently, and I am simply telling you the truth. They stood there in the snow-lit darkness, the distance between them charged with all the things neither of them could say, until finally Eleanor stepped back and wiped her eyes with brisk efficiency. We should bank the fire and get some sleep, she said, her voice determinedly practical. Tomorrow we need to review the feed inventory and plan the breeding schedule for spring. Victoria let her retreat, understanding that she needed space to process what had passed between them. But as he lay in bed that night, listening to the wind howl around the ranch house, he knew with absolute certainty that he was falling in love with Eleanor Price. January brought brutal cold and several feet of snow that kept them trapped on the ranch for days at a time. Eleanor's pregnancy advanced steadily, and Victoria found himself watching her with increasing concern as she grew more ungainly and tired. She refused to slow down, working through the accounts with the same fierce determination, but he could see the strain in her face at the end of each day. You need to rest more, he said one afternoon after finding her asleep at the desk, her head pillowed on a stack of invoices. She jerked awake, immediately defensive. I am fine. There is still so much to do before the baby comes. The ranch will survive if you take an afternoon off, Victoria said firmly. He pulled her to her feet, ignoring her protests, and led her to the small sitting room where the fire burned warm and bright. Sit. I am going to make you tea, and you are going to tell me what you need for the baby. Eleanor sank into the chair with a sigh that betrayed how exhausted she truly was. I do not need anything. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time without special preparations. Eleanor. He knelt beside her chair so he could look directly into her eyes. Let me help you. Please. She looked away, her jaw tight with pride and fear and something else he could not name. I have a little money saved from my wages. I was planning to buy fabric in town and sew what I need. The seamstress in Fairplay is making a layering basket, blankets, and clothes, Victoria said. I ordered them 3 weeks ago. They should be ready by February. Her head whipped around, her eyes wide. You what? You work for me, which means you and the baby are my responsibility, he said steadily. I am not going to let you go through this alone when I have the means to help. That is not your responsibility, she said, but her voice shook. This child is not yours. Victoria reached out and took her hand, feeling the delicate bones beneath the work-roughened skin. Maybe not by blood, but I care about what happens to both of you, Eleanor. Let me do this. She looked at their joined hands, and when she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Why are you being so kind to me? Because you deserve kindness, he said simply. And because somewhere along the way you became important to me. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and outside the wind drove snow against the windows in soft whispers. Eleanor's fingers tightened around his. I am afraid, she admitted, so quietly he almost did not hear her. I am afraid of the birth, afraid of being a mother, afraid of failing this child the way I have failed at everything else. You have not failed at anything, Victoria said fiercely. You have survived impossible circumstances and turned them into strength. You will be a wonderful mother. You cannot know that. I can know that you fight for what you love. And you already love this baby. I can see it in the way you rest your hand on your belly, in the way you plan for the future. That love will carry you through. Eleanor looked at him with such raw emotion that it stole his breath. And then she leaned forward and rested her forehead against his shoulder in a gesture of trust that felt more intimate than any kiss. Victoria wrapped his arms around her carefully, mindful of her belly, and held her while she trembled with the release of fears she had carried alone for too long. I do not know what I did to deserve finding you, she whispered against his shirt. You walked through my door when you were starving and exhausted, and you saved my family's legacy, Victoria said into her hair. I think I am the one who got lucky. They stayed like that until the fire burned low, and when Victoria finally helped her up to her room, his heart felt fuller than it had since his father died. February arrived with a false thaw that turned the snow to slush and made the roads briefly passable. Victoria took the wagon to town and returned with the items from the seamstress, along with a cradle he had commissioned from the carpenter, made of polished pine with delicate carvings of flowers along the rails. Eleanor cried when she saw it, and this time she did not try to hide her tears. It is beautiful, she said, running her fingers over the smooth wood. Too beautiful for me. Nothing is too beautiful for you, Victoria said, and he was surprised by the vehemence in his own voice. She looked up at him, her gray eyes searching his face. You look at me like you are seeing someone else, someone better than I am. I see exactly who you are, he countered. You are the one who cannot see it yet. Eleanor stood with difficulty, one hand braced against her lower back, and crossed the room to where he stood. At 7 months pregnant, she had to tilt her head back to look up at him, and the lamplight caught the silver in her eyes and turned them luminous. If things were different, she said slowly. If I were not carrying another man's child, if I had not been ruined and cast out, would you truly want someone like me? Victoria reached up and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing the arch of her cheekbones. There is no version of you that I would not want. The baby is part of who you are now, part of your story, and I would not change a single thing about that story because it brought you here to me. That is impossible, she whispered, but there was hope in her voice, fragile and new. It is the absolute truth, he said. And then, because he could not help himself, because he had been wanting to for months, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was soft and careful, a question more than a demand, and for a heartbeat Eleanor stayed frozen against him. Then she made a small sound in the back of her throat and kissed him back, her hands coming up to grip his shoulders, and Victoria felt the world realign itself around this moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor looked dazed. We should not have done that. Probably not, Victoria agreed, though he made no move to step away. Do you want me to apologize? She stared at him, her lips still swollen from his kiss, her cheeks flushed. No, she said finally. No, I do not want you to apologize, but I do not know what to do with this. We do not have to do anything, Victoria said gently. We can just let it be what it is for now. And what is it? He smiled, unable to stop himself. Something good, something worth protecting. Eleanor laid her hand over his heart, and he could feel the trembling in her fingers. I am not accustomed to good things. Then it is time you learned, he said, and kissed her again. Over the following weeks, something shifted between them, a tenderness that colored every interaction. Victoria found excuses to touch her, a hand at her elbow to steady her on the stairs, fingers brushing hers when he handed her papers, a palm resting briefly on her shoulder when he passed her desk. Eleanor, in turn, began to seek out his presence, working in the office even when he was just sitting reading the newspaper, reaching for his hand when they walked to the barn to check on a mare about to foal. They did not speak of the future or define what was growing between them. Eleanor was too afraid of hoping for too much, and Victoria understood that she needed time to believe he meant what he said. So he showed her instead, in small, constant ways, that she was cherished. The ranch continued to improve under Eleanor's careful management. By March, they had paid down a significant portion of the loan, and the cattle were healthy and ready for the spring calving season. Victoria hired back a fourth ranch hand specifically to help with the increased workload, and Eleanor interviewed the candidates with the same thorough attention she gave to every business decision, ultimately selecting a quiet man from Wyoming who had excellent references and did not ask unnecessary questions about her situation. You are good at reading people, Victoria observed after the new hand had settled into the bunkhouse. Eleanor looked up from the contract she was drafting, one hand absently rubbing her belly where the baby was kicking. Numbers are easier than people. But I have learned that competence and character usually show in the details. He answered questions directly, his references checked without inconsistencies, and he looked me in the eye even though I am clearly unmarried and pregnant. That suggests integrity. Victoria moved behind her chair and gently massaged her shoulders, feeling the knots of tension there. You are also good at carrying the weight of the world. You should practice delegating some of that burden. She leaned back into his touch with a sigh. I am not accustomed to trusting others to carry their share. I know, he said softly, working at a particularly tight spot until she groaned with relief. But you have me now. You do not have to do everything alone anymore. Eleanor reached up and caught his hand, bringing it around to press against her belly. Beneath his palm, Victoria felt the baby kick, a strong, definite thump that made his breath catch. The baby is active today, Eleanor said. I think it knows spring is coming. Victoria knelt beside her chair, keeping his hand on her belly, marveling at the life moving beneath his palm. "Does it hurt when the baby kicks like that?" "Sometimes," she admitted. "Mostly it is just strange, like my body is not entirely my own anymore." "You are creating a whole person in there," Victoria said, his voice full of wonder. "That is extraordinary." Eleanor looked down at him, and in her eyes was a longing so intense it made his chest ache. "You really mean that? You are not just being kind?" "I have never been more serious about anything," he said. He leaned forward and pressed a kiss to her belly, feeling the baby move again beneath his lips. "This child is lucky to have you as a mother." "Victoria," she whispered, and there was something breaking open in her voice, some final wall crumbling. "I am in love with you." He looked up at her, his heart hammering. "Say that again." "I am in love with you," she repeated, tears streaming down her face now. "I have been fighting it for months because it seemed impossible, because I thought you could not possibly feel the same way, but I cannot keep pretending anymore. I love you." Victoria surged to his feet and pulled her up into his arms as carefully as he could manage, kissing her with all the pent-up emotion he had been holding back. "I love you too," he said against her mouth. "I have loved you since you stood in my doorway and announced you could save my ranch. I have loved you through every ledger and every late night and every moment of watching you be braver than anyone I have ever known." Eleanor sobbed and laughed at the same time, clinging to him. "This is insane. I am 8 months pregnant with another man's baby." "I do not care," Victoria said fiercely. "I want you, Eleanor. I want you and the baby and whatever future we can build together. Marry me." She pulled back to stare at him in shock. "What? Marry me?" he repeated, cupping her face in his hands. "Not because you need my protection or because it is practical, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Marry me because I love you and you love me, and that is reason enough." "People will talk," she said weakly. "They will know the baby is not yours. Let them talk." "I do not care what anyone thinks except you." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the corner of her mouth. "Marry me, Eleanor, please." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for any trace of doubt or pity, and apparently finding none because she smiled, brilliant and genuine and more beautiful than anything he had ever seen. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married a week later by the circuit preacher who came through Fairplay on his monthly rounds, with the ranch hands and the cook as witnesses. Eleanor wore a simple blue dress that Victoria bought from the general store, and he wore his father's good suit that he had not touched since the funeral. The ceremony was brief and practical, but when Victoria slipped his mother's ring onto Eleanor's finger and kissed her as his wife, the moment felt as sacred as any cathedral wedding. That night, lying in bed with Eleanor curled carefully against his side, her belly warm between them, Victoria felt a peace he had not known since his father died. Eleanor's hand rested over his heart, and he covered it with his own. "Thank you," she whispered into the darkness. "For what?" "For seeing me when I thought I was invisible. For loving me when I thought I was unlovable. For choosing me." Victoria turned to face her, propping himself up on one elbow so he could see her expression in the moonlight streaming through the window. "You saved my ranch and my life, Eleanor Lancaster. I am the one who should be thanking you." She smiled, and in that smile was all the hope and trust he had worked so hard to earn. "I think we saved each other." "Then we are both lucky," he said, and kissed her until she sighed against his mouth. The baby came 3 weeks later on a bright April morning when the aspen trees were just beginning to bud, and the meadows were carpeted with wildflowers. Eleanor's labor started just before dawn, and Victoria rode hard to Fairplay to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Henderson, who had delivered half the babies in the territory. Labor lasted through the morning and into the afternoon, and Victoria paced the kitchen while the cook tried to distract him with coffee and food he could not eat. From upstairs, he could hear Eleanor's cries, and every sound made him want to break down the door and demand to be let in to help her, even though he knew there was nothing he could do. Finally, as the sun was beginning to sink toward the mountains, he heard a new sound, the sharp, indignant wail of a newborn baby. Victoria was up the stairs before he realized he had moved, stopping just outside the bedroom door as Mrs. Henderson emerged with a bundle in her arms. "You have a son," she said, smiling, "and your wife did beautifully. She is asking for you." Victoria took the baby with trembling hands, looking down at the tiny red face, the shock of dark hair, the impossibly small fingers that curled around his thumb with surprising strength. The baby stopped crying and blinked up at him with unfocused eyes, and Victoria felt his heart expand to encompass this new person in a way he had not anticipated. "Hello," he whispered. "Welcome to the world, little one." He carried the baby into the bedroom where Eleanor lay exhausted and pale against the pillows, her hair damp with sweat but her eyes bright. She smiled when she saw them, and Victoria sat carefully on the edge of the bed, placing the baby in her arms. "He is perfect," Eleanor said, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. She touched the baby's face with wondering fingers, tracing the curve of his cheek, the shell of his ear. "I was so afraid, but he is perfect." "You are perfect," Victoria said, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "How do you feel?" "Like I was run over by a stampede," she admitted with a tired laugh. "But also like I could conquer the world." The baby made a small snuffling sound and turned his face toward Eleanor's chest, already searching for food with the instinct of the newborn. Mrs. Henderson bustled back in with clean linens and helped Eleanor arrange things, then shooed Victoria out while she got mother and baby settled. Victoria paced downstairs for another hour before the midwife finally gave him permission to return. He found Eleanor sitting up in bed, the baby nursing contentedly, and the look on her face was one of such profound love and exhaustion that it made his throat tight. "Can I stay?" he asked from the doorway. "Please," Eleanor said. "I do not want to be alone." He settled into the chair beside the bed, content to watch her with the baby, this new family they had created from desperation and ledgers and unexpected love. After a while, the baby fell asleep, milk drunk and peaceful, and Eleanor looked up at Victoria with tears in her eyes. "I never thought I could have this," she said quietly. "A husband who loves me, a healthy baby, a home. I thought I had ruined everything." "You built something better than you lost," Victoria said. "Something real and earned, not just given by circumstance." She reached out her free hand and he took it, threading their fingers together. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names over the past month but had not settled on anything definite. Now, looking at the sleeping baby, Victoria thought about legacy and new beginnings and the ranch that would someday belong to this child. "What about Thomas?" he suggested. "After my father. He would have loved you, Eleanor. He would have been proud to have you as a daughter." Eleanor's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Thomas Lancaster. I like that very much." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, and the room filled with shadows, their son sleeping between them, the future stretching ahead with all its uncertainty and promise. Spring turned into summer, and the ranch flourished under Eleanor's continued management and Victoria's skilled handling of the cattle and land. Thomas grew into a healthy, cheerful baby who seemed to smile at everything, and Victoria took to fatherhood with an enthusiasm that sometimes surprised Eleanor. He was the one who walked the floor with Thomas during the colicky evenings, who changed diapers without complaint, who sang off key lullabies that somehow always put the baby to sleep. "You are going to spoil him," Eleanor said one evening in June, watching Victoria play with Thomas on a blanket spread in the office while she worked on the quarterly accounts. "That is my right as his father," Victoria said, making silly faces that had Thomas giggling and waving his arms. Eleanor felt her heart squeeze at the casual way he said father, as if there had never been any question about his claim to the child. "He is lucky to have you." Victoria looked up at her, and there was something serious in his expression. "I am the lucky one. Both of you gave me back purpose when I thought I had lost everything." She set down her pen and crossed to sit beside them on the floor, ignoring the protests from her body that still had not fully recovered from childbirth. Thomas immediately grabbed for her hair, and she laughed as she gently disentangled his fingers. "The quarterly report shows we are ahead of projections by almost 10%, she said. "If we maintain this trajectory, you will be able to pay off the entire loan by next spring instead of spreading it over 3 more years." "You mean we will be able to pay it off," Victoria corrected. "This ranch belongs to both of us now, Eleanor. You earned that with your work." She had not quite gotten used to thinking of herself as part owner of anything, let alone a successful cattle ranch. The legal papers Victoria had drawn up after their marriage put her name alongside his on all the property deeds and business accounts, a gesture of trust and partnership that still sometimes took her breath away. "I was thinking," Victoria said, scooping up Thomas and settling the baby against his shoulder. "Once we have the loan paid off, we should think about expanding. There is good grazing land along the northern boundary that borders the national forest. If we could lease it from the government, we could run another 200 head. Eleanor's mind immediately began calculating costs and potential returns, the numbers arranging themselves into neat projections. "We would need to increase the bunkhouse capacity and hire at least 2 more hands. But the market price for beef is stable, and Denver is growing fast enough that demand should stay high for at least the next decade. It could work." "There is also the bookkeeping business," Victoria reminded her. 3 ranchers have already asked if you would take them on as clients. You could do that from home, work around Thomas's schedule." She had been considering the offers but had been hesitant to commit to anything that would take her attention away from the ranch. "I do not want to neglect what we have built here." "You could not neglect it if you tried," Victoria said with complete confidence. "You have systems in place that practically run themselves now, and having additional income streams would make us more stable in case the cattle market ever crashes." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder, careful not to disturb Thomas, who was already drowsing. "When did you become so good at business strategy?" "I had an excellent teacher," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "She taught me that numbers tell stories if you know how to listen." They sat there as the evening light turned gold, the 3 of them together in the office where Victoria and Eleanor had first learned to trust each other. Outside, the ranch spread across the valley in neat, prosperous order, cattle grazing in green pastures, horses running in the far corral, the mountains standing eternal watch over it all. By August, Eleanor had taken on 2 ranching clients for bookkeeping services, working a few hours each day while Thomas napped and generating enough additional income to justify hiring a local girl to help with the cooking and cleaning. Victoria continued to push for the northern land lease, and together they drafted a proposal for the land office that emphasized conservation and sustainable grazing practices. The summer was hot and dry, and Victoria spent long days in the saddle making sure the cattle had access to water and monitoring the grazing rotation. Eleanor missed him during those long days, and she started bringing Thomas out to the pastures in the wagon so they could share lunch together in the shade of the cottonwood trees. Thomas loved these excursions, fascinated by the horses and the movement of the cattle, and Victoria would hold him in the saddle for brief rides that made the baby shriek with delight. "He is going to be a rancher," Victoria said one afternoon, watching Thomas grab at the horse's mane with determined baby fists. "He is going to be whatever he wants to be," Eleanor countered, but she smiled as she said it, charmed by the picture they made together. That night, after Thomas was asleep in his cradle, Eleanor and Victoria lay in bed talking about the future in the lazy, comfortable way of people who had stopped being afraid of their own happiness. "I want more children," Victoria said, his hand tracing idle patterns on her hip. "If you want them too. I know Thomas is still so small, but someday." Eleanor turned to face him in the darkness, her heart full. "I want that too. I want to give Thomas siblings, and I want to have babies with you that we plan for and anticipate together." "How many?" he asked, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "At least 2 more," she said. "Maybe 3, enough to fill this house with noise and chaos." Victoria pulled her closer, and she could feel his happiness radiating through his skin. "I love you," he said. "I love you and Thomas and the family we are building and the life we are creating. Sometimes I cannot believe this is real." "It is real," Eleanor assured him, her hand over his heart feeling the steady beat there. "We made it real by choosing each other every day." They made love slowly, tenderly, relearning each other's bodies after the long months of Eleanor's pregnancy and recovery. Afterwards, wrapped in each other's arms, Eleanor felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. She had come to this ranch desperate and afraid, carrying someone else's child and her own broken dreams. Now she had a husband who loved her without reservation, a son who was thriving, and work that challenged and fulfilled her. It was more than she had ever allowed herself to hope for. The land lease came through in September, and Victoria immediately began planning the expansion. Eleanor helped him calculate exactly how many additional cattle they could support and worked with him to design an efficient rotation schedule. They hired 2 more ranch hands, both young men eager to prove themselves, and by October the operation was running smoothly at the larger scale. Thomas celebrated his 6-month birthday by learning to sit up on his own, and by charming every person who came within range of his gap-toothed smile. He had Eleanor's gray eyes and dark hair, but Victoria's easy temperament and infectious laugh, and watching the 2 of them together never failed to make Eleanor's chest tight with emotion. In November, the circuit preacher came through again, and Victoria asked him to perform a baptism for Thomas. The entire community of Fairplay turned out for the occasion, ranchers and miners and merchants gathering in the small church to welcome the Lancaster baby into the faith. Eleanor stood with Thomas in her arms, Victoria's hand warm at her back, and listened to the preacher talk about new beginnings and God's grace. And she thought about the long, strange road that had brought her to this moment. After the service, the church ladies laid out a feast, and people came up to congratulate them and coo over Thomas. Eleanor noticed the way some of the older women did quick mental calculations about dates and pregnancy timing, but no one said anything unkind. In the rough democracy of the frontier, a person's past mattered less than their present character, and Eleanor had proven herself in the community through her work and her obvious devotion to her family. "You did beautifully today," Victoria murmured as they drove home in the wagon, Thomas asleep between them. "I was terrified," Eleanor admitted. "I kept thinking someone would stand up and announce that I was a fraud, that I had no right to be there." "You belong here just as much as anyone," Victoria said firmly. "More than most, because you chose this life deliberately instead of just being born into it." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the mountains turn purple in the fading light. "I chose you," she said. Everything else just came with that choice. "Best decision you ever made," he said with such obvious satisfaction that she laughed. "Also the most terrifying." "Also that," he agreed and kissed the top of her head. Winter came early that year, with the first serious snow falling in mid-November and continuing intermittently through December. Eleanor had worried about how Thomas would handle the cold in the long, dark months, but the baby seemed to thrive on the cozy routine of indoor days, content to play on the floor of the office while Eleanor worked or to sleep strapped to her chest while she moved around the house. Victoria spent the winter making improvements to the ranch infrastructure, building a new calving barn and repairing fences and equipment in preparation for spring. In the evenings, the three of them would gather in the sitting room, Thomas playing with his toys while Victoria read aloud from the Denver newspaper, and Eleanor worked on her knitting, attempting to make a blanket that so far resembled a lumpy trapezoid more than anything useful. "You are very bad at that," Victoria observed one night, watching her struggle with dropped stitches. "I am excellent with numbers and terrible with crafts," Eleanor said, glaring at the offending yarn. "We cannot all be good at everything." Victoria plucked Thomas off the floor where he had been chewing enthusiastically on a wooden horse and settled the baby in his lap. "I am good at ranching and being charming. You are good at everything else. Seems like a fair division of labor." Eleanor threw a ball of yarn at him, which he caught one-handed while Thomas shrieked with delight at the game. They dissolved into laughter, and the moment was so perfectly ordinary and happy that Eleanor had to stop and memorize it, storing it away against all the years of loneliness that had come before. Christmas that year was everything the previous one had not been. They put up a proper tree in the sitting room and decorated it with strings of popcorn and cranberries. Eleanor baked cookies using recipes from Victoria's mother's old cookbook, and Victoria carved a set of wooden animals for Thomas, who was fascinated by anything he could grab and gum on. On Christmas morning, they opened presents in front of the fire, Thomas more interested in the paper than the actual gifts, and Eleanor gave Victoria a leather-bound journal where she had written detailed records of Thomas's first year, every milestone and funny moment carefully documented. "So when he is older, you can tell him stories about when he was small," she said as Victoria paged through it with visible emotion. "This is incredible," he said, his voice rough. "Eleanor, this must have taken you months." "I worked on it during his naps," she said, pleased by his reaction. "I wanted to capture everything before I forget." Victoria set the journal carefully aside and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a thoroughness that made her breath catch. "You are the most thoughtful person I have ever known. You make me want to be," she said against his mouth. "You make me want to be the best version of myself." They spent the rest of Christmas Day in peaceful domesticity, playing with Thomas and eating too much food and simply enjoying being together. That night, after Thomas was asleep, Eleanor told Victoria that she was pregnant again. He stared at her for a long moment, then let out a whoop of joy that probably woke the ranch hands in the bunkhouse. He swept her up in his arms and spun her around until she was dizzy and laughing and demanding to be put down before she got sick. "I am going to be a father again," he said, wonder in his voice. "You are already a father," Eleanor reminded him. "I know, but this one we made together," he said, his hand splaying across her still flat belly. "This one is ours from the very beginning." Eleanor covered his hand with hers, understanding what he meant even though she would never love this new baby more than she loved Thomas. "Are you happy?" "I am so happy I could burst," he said, and then he was kissing her again, pouring all his joy and love into the contact until she was breathless and clinging to him. The new baby was due in August, and Eleanor sailed through the pregnancy with much more confidence than she had the first time. She continued to work on the ranch accounts and her bookkeeping clients, only scaling back in the final month when the summer heat made everything exhausting. Thomas was a year and a half by then, a sturdy toddler who followed Victoria everywhere, and who had just started stringing together two-word sentences that mostly involved horse and papa. Victoria was ridiculously protective during the pregnancy, constantly trying to make Eleanor rest or eat more or avoid any kind of exertion. She tolerated it with good humor, understanding that it came from love even when it drove her slightly crazy. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she reminded him for the 100th time when he tried to prevent her from lifting a basket of laundry. "I know," he said, taking the basket anyway, "but I like taking care of you. Humor me." Their daughter was born on a hot August night, arriving much faster than Thomas had, and with considerably less drama. Victoria was there for the birth this time, holding Eleanor's hand and talking her through the contractions until finally the baby slipped into the midwife's waiting hands, squalling her outrage at the world. "A girl," Mrs. Henderson announced, laying the baby on Eleanor's chest. "And she has got a healthy set of lungs on her." Eleanor looked down at her daughter, at the tiny perfect face and the wispy blonde hair that was so light it was almost white, and felt her heart split open with love. The baby stopped crying and blinked up at her with eyes that were still the indeterminate blue of all newborns, but that Eleanor suspected would turn to match Victoria's clear hazel. "Hello, sweet girl," Eleanor whispered. "We have been waiting for you." Victoria leaned over them both, his hand gentle on the baby's head, his eyes bright with tears he did not bother to hide. "She is beautiful. She looks just like you." They named her Margaret after Eleanor's mother, though they called her Maggie from the start. Thomas was fascinated by his new sister, wanting to touch her constantly and bring her his toys, and Victoria had to supervise closely to prevent the enthusiastic toddler from accidentally smothering the baby with affection. The ranch continued to prosper through that fall and into the next year. They paid off the loan in full by the following spring, just as Eleanor had projected, and the freedom from that debt allowed them to invest more in improvements and expansion. Eleanor's bookkeeping business grew to include 6 regular clients, and she hired a young woman from town to help with the administrative work, teaching her the systems and practices that had saved the Lancaster ranch. By the time Maggie was walking and Thomas was 4 years old, the ranch had tripled its original herd size and was recognized throughout Colorado as one of the best managed operations in the territory. Other ranchers came to Victoria for advice, and Eleanor taught bookkeeping classes in Fairplay during the winter months, sharing her knowledge with other women who wanted to understand the financial side of their family businesses. On a warm June evening in 1880, Eleanor stood on the porch of the ranch house watching Thomas and Maggie play in the yard while Victoria worked with a young colt in the corral. She was 6 months pregnant with their 3rd child, and her hand rested on her belly feeling the baby's movements. 4 years since she had walked into Victoria's office desperate and alone, and now she had this, a family and a home and work she loved and a husband who still looked at her like she hung the moon. Victoria finished with the colt and walked over to the porch, sweaty and dusty and grinning. He pulled Eleanor into his arms despite her protests about his state and kissed her soundly. "I love you," he said, as he did approximately a dozen times a day. "I love you too," Eleanor said, as she always did, "even when you are filthy and getting dirt all over my clean dress." "Especially then," he said, unrepentant. He looked out at the ranch, at the neat buildings and the healthy livestock and the mountains rising beyond. "My father would be proud of what we have done here." "We still have his legacy," Eleanor agreed, "but we have built something new on top of it. Something that belongs to us and to our children." Thomas came running up then, demanding that Papa come see the frog he had found, and Maggie toddled after him shrieking, "Frog, frog," at the top of her lungs. Victoria scooped up both children, settling one on each hip despite their considerable combined weight, and Eleanor laughed at the picture they made, her heart so full it hurt. That night, after the children were asleep, and she and Victoria lay in bed talking about names for the new baby and whether they should build an addition onto the house, Eleanor thought about the man she had left behind in Philadelphia, the one who had broken his promises and sent her away. She had not thought about him in years, and when she did now, it was without pain or regret. That rejection had brought her here, to this life, to this man who loved her with unwavering devotion, to these children and this ranch and this future that stretched ahead bright with possibility. "What are you thinking about?" Victoria asked, noticing her silence. "I am thinking that I would not change a single thing about how we got here," Eleanor said. "Every hard moment, every fear, every mistake led me to you. I would walk that road 1,000 times over if it meant ending up here." Victoria pulled her close, mindful of her belly between them. "I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." "You already do," Eleanor said. "Every single day." Their third child was another boy, born in September and named after Victoria's grandfather. They called him James, and he was a quiet, thoughtful baby who seemed content to observe the world from whatever vantage point his busy family placed him. Thomas took his role as big brother very seriously, and Maggie was convinced the baby existed solely for her entertainment, which led to much negotiation about appropriate ways to play with infants. The years that followed were full and busy and richer than Eleanor had ever imagined possible. The ranch continued to grow, and Eleanor's bookkeeping business became successful enough that she eventually wrote a manual on ranch accounting that was distributed throughout the territory. Victoria served a term as chairman of the local Ranchers Association and helped establish fair pricing standards that protected small operations from being exploited by the big Denver meat packers. They added the house addition when Eleanor got pregnant for the 4th time, a daughter they named Catherine, who arrived in the spring of 1882, and who had Victoria's hazel eyes and a temperament that could only be described as determined. 4 children in 6 years made for a chaotic household, but it was the kind of chaos Eleanor had dreamed of during those long, lonely months before she found her way to the Lancaster ranch. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Victoria took Eleanor into Denver for a weekend, leaving the children in the capable hands of the cook and the ranch hands who had become like family. They stayed in a proper hotel and ate in restaurants and went to the theater, playing at being a fashionable couple instead of hard-working ranchers. It was lovely and romantic, but Eleanor found herself missing the children and the ranch by the 2nd day. "We have become completely domesticated," she said as they rode the train back to Fairplay. "Is that a bad thing?" Victoria asked, his arm around her shoulders. Eleanor leaned into him, watching the mountains roll past the window. "No, it is the best thing. I just never expected to be someone who could not wait to get home to her life instead of wanting to escape from it." "We built something worth coming home to," Victoria said. "That is nothing to apologize for." The train pulled into Fairplay as the sun was setting, painting the mountains gold and purple, and their children were waiting on the platform with the cook, all of them jumping and waving the moment they spotted their parents. Eleanor felt her heart swell as Thomas helped Maggie wave, as James peeked shyly around the cook's skirts, as baby Catherine shrieked with delight in the cook's arms. "There is our life," Victoria said, and Eleanor heard the same awe in his voice that she felt in her chest. "There is our life," she agreed, And when they stepped off the train into the chaos of their children's greetings, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that this was everything she had ever wanted, everything she had stopped believing she could have. The Ledgers had saved the ranch by spring just as she had promised, but Victoria had saved her heart, and together they had built something that would last generations. As Thomas grabbed her hand and started talking a mile a minute about the calf that had been born while they were gone, as Maggie demanded to be picked up and Catherine laughed from Victoria's arms, and James tugged on his father's coat with questions about the train, Eleanor felt the last shadow of her old life finally dissolve completely. She was Eleanor Lancaster, wife and mother and partner and bookkeeper, and she was exactly where she belonged,